It's enough to say abyss and satire of the abyss. Begin and end with a that's enough, which would have nothing to do with the sufficing or self-sufficing of sufficiency, nothing to do with satisfaction. Reconsider, further on, the whole syntax of these untranslatable locutions, the width of the nothing to do, right if possible, finally, without with, not without, but without with, finally, not even oneself. Opening with the satis, the enough, inside and outside, above and below, to left and right, satire, farce on the edge of excess, displacement of the pivot, cheville, also ankle, avec, cum, ama, semblou, etc., since ossia et grammar. Seek, as always, the lock and the little key, lure of writing with oneself. What is a title? And what if Parergon were the title? Here the false title is art. A seminar would treat of art and the fine arts. It would thus answer to a program and to one of its great questions. These questions are all taken from a determinate set, determined according to history and system. The history would be that of philosophy, within which the history of the philosophy of art would be marked off, insofar as it treats of art and of the history of art. Its models, its concepts, its problems have not fallen from the skies. They have been constituted according to determinate modes at determinate moments. This set forms a system, a greater logic, and an encyclopedia within the fine arts would stand out as a particular region. The aggregation de philosophie also forms a history and a system. How a question of this type, art, becomes inscribed in a program?
He gets into the details about work of art. But since he's writing, it starts with the linguistic elements of what he's trying to describe. And he gives you the details about possible ways concerning work of art. And of course, even without the details, you still have to come to the philosophy behind art. And among all the details, the most important details here are Parergon and ergon. Those words are from Greek. Parergon is something addition to the work, and whereas ergon is the work. But in the original Greek, what that means is ergon as the true, whereas Parergon is something addition to it. So if you look at this way, then you begin to think the painting and the frame. But the question is, can a painting truly exist in a society without a frame? And you go to a museum, you will not see a painting, a great painting without a frame. So in other words, ergon, in this case, cannot live without a Parergon. Also, it goes back to the philosophy of art. In modern time, when we say modern time, started with the German idealism. Everything has to go back to Kant. So in Kant's sense, ergon is the work, or the work of one's field. Works of literature, works of music, whatever. According to Kant, Parergon is what is beyond ergon. It is what columns are to buildings or the frame to a painting. You're looking at this, you can't do one without the other. Derrida is to deal with the basic questions of art. He gives you all the words, but his purpose is, what is the most essential question of art? That is representation. Representation, as we learn, as far as English goes, the most authoritative Cambridge dictionary. It states a person or organization that speaks, acts, or is present officially for someone else. People say, can you afford a legal representation? We have understanding of definition of a representation that is a sign, picture, model, etc., or something represents something else, which constantly leads to confusion. The word representation, or the idea of representation, actually is developed from the mimesis. The Greek word mimesis is the basic theoretic principle in creation of art. Something should be artistic. Actually, It's more philosophical and artistic. This principle that is in pretty much all the art categories, such as literary criticism, art theory, and philosophy. It's important that you understand the representation as something is non-sensuous. It concerns more about the intellect than sense. It also concerns the act of expression, the act of resembling, and the presentation of the self. If you go back to the Greek, again, Plato contrasts mimesis with diegesis for narration. Plato never trusted representation. He prefers a storyteller. Diegesis, that's the word for the narrator. In that sense, you will find out that this narrator sometimes not necessarily within the situation. The voice was outside or beyond. We have movies sometimes, people speaking outside the picture. And also we learn this from the European literatures that you have a story going on and all of a sudden the writer gives you this voice. That's the idea of diegesis. This whole thing about the narrator ties into the idea of logos. That's where Plato drives to. Derrida is questioning a function of representation of our time, if it's still working as the way it is supposed to. That's what Derrida is trying to lay out his inquiry.
We must not only turn to the history of philosophy, for example, to the Greater Logic or the Encyclopedia of Hegel, to his lectures on aesthetics, which sketch out precisely one part of the encyclopedia, system of training for teaching, and cycle of knowledge. We must take account of certain specific relays, for example, those of so-called philosophy teaching in France, in the institution of its programs, its forms of examinations and competitions, its scenes and its rhetoric. Here I do no more than name, with a proper name as one of the guiding threads, the necessity of a deconstruction. Following the consistency of its logic, it attacks not only the internal edifice, both semantic and formal, of philosophemes, but also what one would be wrong to assign to it as its external housing, its extrinsic conditions of practice, the historical forms of its pedagogy, the social, economic, or political structures of this pedagogical institution. It is because deconstruction interferes with solid structures, material institutions, and not only with discourses or signifying representations, that it is always distinct from an analysis or a critique. And in order to be pertinent, deconstruction works as strictly as possible in that place where supposedly internal order of the philosophical is articulated by internal and external necessity, with the institutional conditions and forms of teaching, to the point where the concept of institution itself would be subjected to the same deconstructive treatment.
As a start, we must not only turn to the history of philosophy in order to talk about art. Hegel and Kant, those two are still the dominant philosophers in the Western theories of art and art history. And that's why he says necessity of a deconstruction. Deconstruction is Derrida's approach or his method for his inquiry. As he says, in order to be pertinent, deconstruction works as strictly as possible in that place where supposedly internal order of the philosophical is articulated by internal and external necessity with the institutional conditions and the forms of teaching. And he's talking about not only the art theory, but the educational system. I found out that the original, the French copy, published in 1978, very beginning has a page, functions as a note to the reader, avertissement. It means a caution or warning. So basically he's saying that there are four things he's trying to do in this book. Number one is to seek philosophy from Plato, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, which still dominates the discourse on painting. And two, to decipher the singular contract which links the phonic trait, even before the word, to the so-called graphic trait. Third is to analyze the ductus, so the connection, the idiom as of the trait, as a signature of the designer. The artist did the painting. And then that ties into the whole system of production, reduction, reproduction. Fourth goal is attaining, not without taking a part in it, a duel between Heidegger and Shapiro. Derrida says that his job is to find out who really owns Van Gogh's unlaced shoes? Who wins the duel between Heidegger and Shapiro? Or what is the desire for restitution when it relates to the truth in painting by dealing with the Heidegger-Shapiro discourse?
Traditionally, a course begins by the semantic analysis of its title, of the word or concept which entitles it, and which can legitimate its discourse only by receiving its own legitimation from that discourse. Thus, one would begin by asking oneself, what is art? Then, where does it come from? What is the origin of art? This assumes that we reach agreement about what we understand by the word art. Hence, what is the origin of the meaning of art? For these questions, the guiding thread, but it is precisely toward the notion of the thread and the interlacing that I should like to lead you from afar, will always have been the existence of works of art. Hegel says so at the beginning of the lectures on aesthetics. We have before us but a single representation, namely, that there are works of art. This representation can furnish us with an appropriate point of departure. So the question then becomes, what is the origin of the work of art? And it is not without significance that this question gives its title to one of the last great discourses on art, that of Heidegger. This protocol of the question installs us in a fundamental presupposition. It massively predetermines the system and combinatory possibilities of answers. What it begins by implying is that art, the word, concept, the thing, has a unity and what is more, an originary meaning, an etymon, a truth that is one and naked, une vérité unmenue, and that it would be sufficient to unveil it through history. It implies, first of all, that art can be reached following the three ways of word, concept, and thing, or again as signifier, signified, and referent, or even by some opposition between presence and representation.
Now we begin to see, he's going back to the last class we dealt with, the double situation again. So in the last sentence, it says, it implies, first of all, that art can be reached following three ways of word, concept, and thing, or again of signifier, signified, and referent, or even by some opposition between presence and representation. So the last word here, presence and the representation, that's what he's dealing with. As you know, presence means the real. For instance, you take a picture of somebody. The pose with that person is a presence. It's the real. And the photo you take is a representation. So that's how everything works in life so far. Still, we can't get away from that. When we get into the discourse, then here we have a double situation of dilemma. And we have the linguistic, phonic representation, and we have the pictorial, graphic representation. And with these two dilemmas, we have to deal with the language and we have to deal with the visual, the painting. What we needed to find out is what happened with the idea of representation in our time. Is the idea of representation to us still the same as the idea of representation to the Greek guys and to the 19th century European people? Obviously, it's not going to be the same. And as we learned earlier, Foucault's idea in the order of things says Foucault, the classical order of language was the immediate and spontaneous unfolding of representations as a form of knowing which occupied a fundamental situation in relation to all knowledge, so that the things of the world could be known. That in the classical order, the language and the representation are tied together. There is no gap, there is no issue. Because of that, we learn things. Things can be known. However, by the 19th century, language began to fold in upon itself. Okay, that's another tricky part. If you read English, to fold in upon itself, what does that mean? To fold. I fold laundry. In the original French, the word is pli. Pli has two meanings. Meaning to fold, like we know, but also there is a meaning of double. If you read this way, then to fold in upon itself, that makes sense. Then language becomes double. The keyword pli. According to Foucault, that this doubled language that makes a new virtual language. This new language we have now is that our modern phonetic language becomes on its own. So as a language, it used to be a tool that we utilize to know things. You want to study philosophy, you use language as a tool. And now, language becomes on its own. So that's what Foucault means by double. So how does this double harm us? According to Foucault, that because of this doubling, folding, the transition between I think to I am, the verb to be is taken away, because if the language becomes a double, obviously the connection is gone. He's pointing to that direction.
Through history, the crossing can, in this case, just as well denote historicism, the determining character of the historicity of meaning, as it can denote ahistoricity, history crossed, transfixed in the direction of meaning, in the sense of a meaning, in itself ahistorical. If one were to consider the physis, techne, opposition to be irreducible, if one were to accredit so hastily its translation as nature art or nature technique, one would easily commit oneself to thinking that art, being no longer nature, is history. The opposition, nature-history, would be the analogical relay of physis techne. One could thus already say, as for history, we shall have to deal with the contradiction or the oscillation between two apparently incompatible motifs. They both ultimately come under one and the same logical formality, namely that if the philosophy of art always has the greatest difficulty in dominating the history of art, a certain concept of the historicity of art, that this is, paradoxically, because it too easily thinks of art as historical. What I'm putting forward here obviously assumes that transformation of the concept of history from one statement to the other. That will be the work of this seminar.
What Derrida calls this type of doubleness, the old grid, what he says in the of grammatology, external, internal, image, reality, representation, presence, such is the old grid to which is given the task of outlining the domain of science. We have been given this idea of science, or as a discipline, and how we understand ourselves and the world by this old grid. So the grid is a duality. It's the double. That is external, internal, image, reality, representation, presence. The question is that Derrida asks, is this science can still serve purpose today? Obviously, he says that the science can no longer answer to the classical concept of knowledge, the French word épisteme, because it can no longer be thought within the simple difference and the uncompromising exteriority of image and the reality, outside and inside appearance and essence. It's not working anymore. So what do we have inherited? These classical sets of knowledge. And now we have the modern knowledge. We have separate camps that we stuck in the middle. Representation is no longer representative of things, nor linked to the knowledge or understanding of things, but rather to discourse, that is, speaking or writing in our time. We can speak and write as much as we can, but whatever we write or we speak don't always represent what we think we're trying to represent or what we believe should be represented. That's the issue. From Plato all the way down, we always have this old grid. What we have is the binary opposition. The trick is this. Life is a binary. But in this thinking system, this binary opposition at the end forms a hierarchy. It's not that you keep this parallel, this duality even. At some point, the one side will take over. That's the problem. And that's what made Hegel very famous in Western philosophy history. Hegel's dialectic that solves this problem. As we all know, the strong overcomes the weak. That's the end of the binary opposition. Now you understand why our world becomes the way it is today. There is always hierarchy. On one hand, we promote equality, but on the other hand, the equality is constructed by hierarchy. You see how strange that is. Derrida says that he does not believe in this system. He thinks that there is a third way out. He thinks there should be a practical transformation. Not so much to change, but to add to the system. That's what he called deconstruction. He defines as such. At a given moment, when asked if I had a definition of deconstruction, I said more than one language. Deconstruction happens there where one has the experience that there is more than one language. There is more than one language in the world. But even inside the one language, there is more than one language. And so this linguistic multiplicity is what keeps deconstruction occupied or preoccupied. First of all, because I don't believe simply that there is a difference between thinking and language. We think in a language, and the philosophy is tied to language. Even the most faithful translation is all the same, infinitely distant, infinitely different. And that is very good. So translation opens a new history to a text in a new body, in a new culture. That's his definition of deconstruction.
If, therefore, one would approach lessons on art or aesthetics by a question of this type: what is art? What is the origin of art or works of art? What is the meaning of art? What does art mean? Etc. The form of the question would already provide an answer. Art would be predetermined or pre-comprehended in it. A conceptual opposition, which has traditionally served to comprehend art, would always be at work there. For example, the opposition between meaning as inner content and form. Under the apparent diversity of the historical forms of art, the concepts of art, the words which seem to translate art in Greek, Latin, the Germanic languages, etc., but the closer of this list already is problematic, one would be seeking a one and naked meaning which would inform from the inside like a content while distinguishing itself from the forms which it informed. In order to think art in general, and thus accredits a series of opposition, meaning, form, inside, outside, content, container, signified, signifier, represented, representer, etc., which, precisely, structure the traditional interpretation of works of art. In this way, one wonders what a plastic or musical work means to say. Between the question, what is art, what is the origin of the work of art, what is the meaning of art or the history of art, and the hierarchical classification of the art. When a philosopher repeats this question without transforming it, without destroying it in its form, its question form, its onto-interrogative structure, he has already subjected the whole of space to the discursive arts, to the voice and the logos. This can be verified. Theology and hierarchy are prescribed in the envelope of the question. The philosophical encloses art in its circle, but its discourse on art is at once, by the same token, caught in a circle. Like the figure of the third term, the figure of the circle asserts itself at the beginning of the lectures on aesthetics and the origin of the work of art. So very different in their aim, their procedure, their style, these two discourses have in common, as a common interest, that they exclude that which then comes to form, close, and bound them from inside and outside alike.
The same question, what is art? What is the origin of art? What is the meaning of art or art history? I mean, it's the question everybody wants to know. But if we are in the old grid, we're always in a double situation, ended up in a hierarchy, basically we're going nowhere because ultimately we go back to the voice of logos. When we go that way, as Derrida says, we ended up in a circle. Caught in the circle, running around in the circle, all there is you have is a circle. The word circle, again, when we say in English, is a circle. Besides the circle in French, word circle means a colonial administrative unit of the French overseas empire. The French writing always use those double meaning words. You think you're reading a circle, and there's this sense of power and the sense of appropriation. The idea is that if we continue to follow Hegel or Heidegger, their art theory and their artistic discourse, we ended up in a circle. We can't get out. It is a circle of ontological long march that constitutes entrampment, a circular ontological trap. In this context, we have to go back again to the Derrida's basic idea of things. The question, again, is what is ontology? Ontology means the logos, the discourse, science, or knowledge of on. In Greek means being. Ontology is a Greek way of asking questions about and producing a discourse of potentially a science of existence. As you read in my book, I even made a video on this, the lowercase being and the uppercase being. That's what we're dealing with. Heidegger's contribution is that he was the first philosopher distinguished the idea of Sein and Sein. Both are German terms, and we can't really translate that in English. What we did was we translated Sein as the lowercase being and the Sein as the uppercase being. And the problem is that this is not a linguistic difference. It's an ontological difference. Uppercase being is when we say this is a being, existence. But whenever you say that, that doesn't mean anything. This is existence. So you can't really catch that. There's nothing in there. Lowercase being means to be. So that's to be present. That's something. However, every time you say to be present, you have to say, to use uppercase being as a pre-note. It's always there, presupposed, always. This is what Derrida is trying to deal with here. Heidegger did not really give a clear answer to this difference or to the question. So what Derrida did, he tried to distinguish those two. There is no uppercase being. In fact, there is no lowercase being either, because the movement moves on, does not stop. The first thing Derrida did was that he gives a term to this ontological difference between uppercase being and the lowercase being as what he called the difference. Difference is the difference between the uppercase being and the lowercase being. To be present, it's another problem. We have the famous line from Husserl, the living present, such a big influence in our time. According to Husserl, there's nothing in our everyday experience is not present. That everything we have is now. We live in this perpetual and this punctual movement. It's all but now. That means the living movement. Derrida says there's no such thing. There is nothing present without some traces referring to something non-present, some reference to something else, somewhere else. That is the trace of something that is not present. It determines our experience of the present. And so there is no pure present. A present is always marked by the trace of another present. Everything starts with the trace, which is not very welcome in philosophy. Basically, Derrida is saying before Sein and Sein, before uppercase being and lowercase being, before there is only trace. There's nothing but a trace. Instead, we say this living movement. That's something very big in our pop culture, in our daily life, and in philosophy that dominates our time. Derrida says that is called a trace.
If it were a frame, one of them, Hegel's, gives classical teleology its greatest deployment. He finishes off, as people say, a little too easily, ontoteleology. The other, Heidegger's, attempts by taking a step backwards to go back behind all the oppositions that have commanded the history of aesthetics, that of form and matter, with all its derivatives. Two discourses, then, as different as could be, on either side of a line whose tracing we imagine to be simple and non-decomposable. Not to go any further, for the moment, in the reading of these two discourses, keeping provisionally to their introductions, I notice the following. They both start out from a figure of the circle, and they stay there. They stand in it even if their residence in the circle apparently does not have the same status in each case. For the moment, I do not ask myself, what is a circle? I leave to one side the figure of the circle, its place, its privilege, or its decadence in the history of art. Since the treatment of the circle is part of the history of art and is delimited in it as much as it delimits it, it is perhaps not a neutral gesture to apply to it something that is also nothing other than one of its figures. It is still a circle, which redoubles, remarks, and places on a beam the singularity of this figure. Circle of circles, circle and then circled circle. How could a circle place itself on a beam?
the conclusion here, essentially you follow this sort of a traditional discourse. What you come down to is a circle. After the circle, there's another circle. That is the last sentence. How could a circle place itself in a beam? You put yourself abyss. Drop into abyss. We already talked about this last time, and we talked so many times about the doubles, the mirror. Now, we're back in the mirror again, not just a mirror. Mirrors, circles of mirrors. That's where we are. So with this type of view, it's not just Derrida's particular insight. At least back in the 1930s, Bataille already observed this situation. He gives a name, ontological machines. The essential idea is Hegel, Kant, if you follow that traditional philosophical view. Their systems cannot be fully understood and investigated by just looking at isolated components, but at interrelations constituting their entire systems. So that is, again, we're back into the ontological long march. In Bataille's view, the ontological machines refers to the systems of meaning, social structures, and established norms that human beings created to organize and understand our world, essentially acting as frameworks to contain and control reality. That's the whole idea of the system, and that's why Bataille calls it ontological machines. However, Bataille thought these systems are constantly challenged by a raw, formless, what he called the base matter, which resists being captured by these ontological machines representing a force beyond human comprehension and control, which is really obvious. From Bataille's time to our time is almost 100 years. We're constantly bombarded by this raw, formless base matter. In Derrida's own sense, he's talking about mise on abyme. It's a European phrase. It's been there for a long time. Mise on abyme, to place something into abyss, has been utilized for the Europeans for a long time. This idea on abyme, mise on abyme, has another meaning, in the center of a center. It's an abyss, but in the center of a center. So in the middle of the abyss, the reality is that's how everything formed in Europe. You can easily see this in Europe. The famous church, Hagia Sophia, on the mosaic. In the middle was Mary. And one side is the kings, Justin the First. And on the other side is Constantine the First. They're both offering Mary. Within the offering reflects the whole picture itself. You will find out in the European logos, like the European noble family, their arms, their logos of the clan design. If you look into the design, it's the little circle goes out the big circle. It's like a maze. I mean, that's why they call it on a beam. And particularly with the Great British Empire in the 1700s, 1800s, it's all into this abyme. Of course, we're very familiar with the Spanish painter Velázquez, his painting, Las Minas. Essentially, what we're going back is the same thing, Foucault's section. Alphabetic writing is already itself a form of duplication, since it represents not the signified, but the phonetic elements by which it is signified. Writing in Western culture automatically dictates that we place ourselves in a virtual space of self-representation and duplication. Since writing refers not to a thing but to speech, a work of language only advances more deeply into the intangible density of the mirror, calls forth the double of this already doubled writing, discovers in this way a possible and impossible infinity, ceaselessly strives after speech, maintains it beyond the death that condemns it, and frees a murmuring stream. This presence of repeated speech in writing undeniably gives what we call a work of language ontological status. So essentially, in the doubled situations, the linguistic representation or the graphic representation, what we believed we had was an ontological status. And now that is challenged.